She sang a lullaby, and 3 boys who hadn't moved in months turned their heads toward the sound of her voice. This is not a story about a debt being paid. This is a story about a man who locked himself away from his own children, a woman who walked in expecting nothing, and 3 little boys who had been waiting, in silence, for someone to finally hold them like they mattered. Welcome to Redemption Tales, where the most dangerous men discover that the bravest thing they'll ever do isn't pulling a trigger. It's learning how to love the people they were too afraid to lose. If stories like this make your heart ache in the best way, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. Now, let me tell you about Richard Davis and the woman who broke through a fortress he built out of grief. Chicago in January doesn't forgive. The wind off Lake Michigan cuts through concrete and bone alike, and by the time Jennifer Torres stepped out of the cab on Astor Street, her fingers were numb inside her thin gloves. She stood on the sidewalk staring up at the Davis estate, a limestone mansion set back from the street behind wrought iron gates and bare oak trees, their branches clawing at a pewter sky like skeletal hands. The house was enormous, beautiful, and somehow, even from the outside, it felt hollow. Jennifer was 26 years old. She had a nursing degree from Loyola, $1,100, in her checking account, and a debt of $80,000 that didn't belong to her, but lived in her name all the same. Her father, Carlos Torres, had borrowed from the wrong people before his restaurant went under. And when Carlos collapsed from a stroke 6 months later, the debt didn't die with his ability to speak. It transferred to the only Torres still standing. Tony Ruiz, the man who held the note, had connections that reached into the upper floors of Chicago's underworld. When he'd called Jennifer into his office above the pawn shop on Cicero Avenue, he hadn't threatened her. He'd smiled. That was worse. 6 months, Tony had said, sliding a folder across the desk. You take care of these kids. You do your job. You keep your mouth shut. After 6 months, we're square. The whole 80. Gone. Jennifer had opened the folder. 3 faces stared back at her. Babies. 18 months old. Triplets. All 3 diagnosed with severe cerebral palsy. All 3 living in a mansion on the Gold Coast. All 3 belonging to Richard Davis. She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. Richard Davis ran the Northside organization. Legitimate businesses stacked on top of operations that no one discussed in daylight. He was 38 years old, worth more than most suburbs, and according to every whisper Jennifer had ever heard, completely untouchable, and apparently completely absent from his own children's lives. The housekeeper, a stiff woman named Mrs. Brennan, led Jennifer through the foyer without small talk. Marble floors, a staircase that curved upward like a cathedral rib. The air smelled like wood polish and something antiseptic underneath, like a hospital trying to disguise itself as a home. The children are on the 2nd floor, Mrs. Brennan said, her heels clicking. Their schedule is posted on the wall outside the nursery. Feeding times, medication times, therapy rotations. Do not deviate. Can I meet them first? Mrs. Brennan paused at the top of the stairs and turned. Her expression wasn't unkind. It was exhausted. The expression of someone who had watched 12 women walk through this door and 12 women walk back out. You can try, she said. The nursery was the most sterile room Jennifer had ever seen outside of an ICU. White walls, white linens, 3 identical medical cribs arranged in a row beneath fluorescent lights that hummed a flat, electric note. Monitors blinked. A feeding pump clicked softly. The curtains were drawn, though it was only 2 in the afternoon. Bernard was in the first crib. He was the largest of the 3, with dark hair that curled against his forehead and wide brown eyes that stared at the ceiling without focus. His body was rigid, arms drawn against his chest, fingers curled inward. Nathan was in the middle, smaller, thinner. His limbs moved in small, involuntary jerks, spastic patterns that Jennifer recognized from her neurology rotation. His eyes were closed, but his face carried tension even in sleep, tiny jaw clenched. Chuck was at the far end, the smallest. He lay perfectly still, turned slightly toward the wall, and he was the only one who reacted when Jennifer approached. A flicker of his eyes, tracking her movement for half a second before drifting away. No music, no color on the walls, no stuffed animals in the cribs. Jennifer set her bag down, pulled a chair between Bernard and Nathan, and sat. She didn't touch them. She didn't speak. She just sat, breathing slowly, letting the room learn her presence. At 11:40 that night, Nathan seized. It wasn't a grand mal. It was a cluster of spasms that locked his small body into an arc, his back lifting off the mattress, a thin, reedy cry escaping his throat. Jennifer was beside him in seconds, hands steady, turning him gently to his side, checking airways, counting seconds. The spasm lasted 40 seconds, then another, then a third, shorter, his body shuddering like a bird caught in wind. When it passed, Nathan was trembling. His eyes were open, wet, and terrified, and his mouth moved without sound. Jennifer didn't think. She didn't reach for the medication chart or the emergency protocol pinned to the wall. She reached back, 20 years back, to her abuela's kitchen in Pilsen, to the smell of cinnamon and rain on a tin roof, and she sang, "Duérmete mi niño, duérmete mi amor." Low, barely above a whisper. Her hand resting lightly on Nathan's chest, feeling the jackrabbit, heartbeat slow beneath her palm. Nathan stopped trembling. Bernard turned his head. It was the first voluntary movement the night nurse's log had recorded in 11 weeks. His eyes found Jennifer's face, and something behind them shifted. Not recognition, not comprehension, but attention. Presence. And Chuck, silent, still, turned to the wall. Chuck made a sound, a single syllable, soft as breath, but unmistakably intentional. Jennifer kept singing. She didn't hear the footstep in the hallway. Didn't see the shadow that fell across the gap beneath the door. Richard Davis stood on the other side, still wearing his overcoat, briefcase in one hand, and he did not move. He listened to a stranger sing a lullaby to the sons he hadn't touched since the night their mother's heart stopped beating on a delivery table 12 floors below, where he'd been pacing a hole in the waiting room floor. His hand found the door frame. His knuckles went white. And he stood there, frozen, until the song ended. Jennifer learned the shape of grief before she learned the layout of the house. It was in the details. The kitchen, enormous granite countertops, a 6-burner stove that looked like it had never been used, was stocked with prepared meals in labeled containers, as if someone had outsourced even the act of eating. The living areas on the first floor were immaculate, decorated in dark wood and leather, but the bookshelves held no photographs. Not one. The hallways smelled of cedar and silence. Every door on the 3rd floor was closed, and Mrs. Brennan had made it clear, with a single sharp look, that the 3rd floor was not part of Jennifer's world. "Mr. Davis works late," Mrs. Brennan had said on the 2nd morning, setting a tray of coffee outside the nursery. "He leaves before 7, returns after midnight. You will not see him often. That is by design." But Jennifer saw him everywhere. His absence was architectural. The nursery had been professionally equipped. Every piece of adaptive equipment top of the line, every medication current, the feeding schedule written in a doctor's handwriting, not a father's. Someone had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars making sure these boys survived. And someone had made absolutely certain that survival was all they were offered. On her 3rd day, Jennifer broke protocol. She opened the curtains. Pale winter light flooded the nursery, and Bernard flinched, then stilled, then turned his face toward the window. Outside, snow was falling in heavy, silent curtains over the back garden, and Bernard watched it with an intensity that Jennifer felt in her sternum. "You've never seen snow from this room, have you?" she whispered. She opened the curtains every morning after that. Then she moved the cribs away from the wall so the boys could see each other. Then she brought a small Bluetooth speaker and played low instrumental music during feeding times. Guitar, piano, nothing abrupt. Nathan's spasm frequency dropped by 1/3 in the first week. Jennifer noted it. Nobody asked. On the 5th day, she brought her guitar. It was an old Yamaha with a crack along the body and strings that needed changing. But it had survived her undergraduate years and 4 apartment moves, and when she sat between the cribs and played a simple chord progression, something extraordinary happened. Bernard's fingers, those rigid, curled fingers that hadn't opened in months, twitched. Not a spasm, not an involuntary reflex. A rhythmic, intentional twitch, as if trying to follow the beat. Jennifer stopped playing. Bernard's fingers stopped. She played again. They twitched again. She pressed her hand to her mouth and breathed through it. Then she kept playing. By the end of the 2nd week, she had established a routine that existed nowhere on Mrs. Brennan's official schedule. Morning light and music during feeding. Tactile therapy at 10. She would hold each boy, skin to skin when possible, rotating through them so each had 30 minutes of uninterrupted contact. Afternoon guitar. Evening lullabies. Between sessions, she talked to them. Not baby talk, not clinical narration. Just talked. About the weather, about the book she was reading, about her abuela's cooking, about nothing and everything, filling the room with the one thing it had been starved of. A human voice that wasn't counting milligrams or recording vitals. The staff watched with the careful detachment of people who'd seen hope arrive and leave 12 times before. The last one, Nurse Colvin, she lasted 4 months, Marcus Bowen told Jennifer one evening. Marcus was Richard's right hand, a tall, broad man in his early 40s with graying temples and the careful eyes of someone who'd spent 2 decades navigating between loyalty and morality. He'd found Jennifer in the kitchen, making chamomile tea, and had sat across from her without being invited. She was good, too, patient, gentle with the boys. Then she got caught, photographing documents from Mr. Davis's study. Jennifer's hands tightened around the mug. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand something." Marcus leaned forward. "Those boys in there, they're not a job to him. They're a wound. Every time someone new walks in, he lets himself believe, for about 5 minutes, that maybe this one will be different. And every time they leave or betray his trust, the wound opens a little wider. So whatever your arrangement is, whatever brought you here, I don't need to know. But if you're going to hurt those boys by leaving, I'd rather you do it now." Jennifer held his gaze. "I'm not going to hurt them." The other 12 said the same thing. She didn't answer. Because Marcus was right. She had come to pay a debt. She had come because Tony Ruiz had given her no choice. She hadn't come for the boys. But the boys didn't know that. And every morning when she opened the curtains and Bernard turned his face toward the light, and Nathan's breathing evened out at the sound of her guitar, and Chuck's dark eyes tracked her across the room with something that looked dangerously close to trust, the reason she'd come mattered less and less. What mattered was that she was here. It was the beginning of the 3rd week when she found the door. She'd gone up to the 3rd floor looking for extra blankets. The heating in the nursery was uneven, and Chuck ran cold at night. The hallway was dim, lit only by a sconce at the far end, and every door was closed. All except one. It was ajar. Just an inch. Enough to see a sliver of wallpaper, soft yellow, with hand-painted animals. giraffes, elephants, a border of tiny stars along the ceiling. Jennifer pushed the door open. It was a nursery. A real nursery. 3 cribs arranged in a semicircle around a rocking chair, a mobile of silver moons hanging motionless above each one. The walls were covered in murals, a gentle savanna scene, warm oranges and greens, a bookshelf stacked with children's stories, a changing table with folded blankets, everything untouched, everything covered in a thin layer of dust. On the rocking chair, folded neatly, was a woman's cardigan, cream-colored cashmere, and on the shelf beside it, a single framed photograph, the only photograph Jennifer had seen in the entire house. A woman with dark hair and a wide, luminous smile, her hands resting on a pregnant belly, looking at the camera like she knew every secret the world had and found them, all delightful. Claire Davis. She had been dead for 18 months, and this room had been waiting for babies who never came to sleep in it. "You shouldn't be up here," Jennifer spun. Richard Davis stood at the end of the hallway. He was still in his suit. Dark navy, perfectly tailored, the knot of his tie loosened just enough to suggest the end of a long day. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with short dark hair, and a jaw that looked carved from the same limestone as his house. His brown eyes held no warmth. They held nothing at all. "I was looking for blankets," Jennifer said. "Chuck gets cold at... There are blankets in the linen closet on the 2nd floor. This floor is off limits." "Mr. Davis, this room... I know what the room is." He crossed the hallway in 4 strides, pulled the door shut, and stood with his hand on the knob, and for one unguarded second, Jennifer saw it. The fracture line running through him. Not anger, not authority. Grief so compressed it had become structural, load-bearing, the thing holding him upright only because he'd forgotten it was the thing crushing him. Then it was gone. His face reset. His hand dropped. "Stay on the 2nd floor," he said, and walked away without looking back. Jennifer stayed on the 2nd floor. But the 2nd floor was where the boys were, and the boys were changing. It started with Bernard, his occupational therapist, who visited 3 times a week and spoke to Jennifer in the clipped tones of someone who didn't believe in miracles, noted on her report that Bernard's hand grip had improved by 40% in 3 weeks. Coincidence, Dr. Moran had written, likely delayed neurological maturation. Jennifer didn't argue. She just kept playing guitar, and Bernard kept twitching his fingers in time, and by the 4th week, he could close his hand around Jennifer's index finger and hold it. Not tightly, not with control, but with intention. Nathan's progress was different. The spasms didn't stop. They couldn't. His form of cerebral palsy involved involuntary muscle contractions that would be lifelong. But their frequency dropped, and more importantly, Nathan's distress during episodes plummeted. Where once he would cry for 20 minutes after a spasm cluster, now Jennifer would sing, and he would settle within 5. His sleep improved. He gained weight. And one morning, while Jennifer was humming and changing his clothes, Nathan laughed. It was a small sound, breathy, uneven, more vibration than voice. But it was unmistakably laughter, and Jennifer had to sit on the floor for a full minute afterward because her legs wouldn't hold her. Chuck was the mystery. He was the most cognitively aware of the 3. His eyes tracked, his responses to stimuli were faster, his muscle tone slightly better. But he was also the most withdrawn. He didn't cry. He didn't vocalize. He simply watched, absorbing everything with an intensity that made Jennifer feel sometimes like she was the one being studied. She focused on him hardest, not with music, not with structured therapy, but with presence. She would hold Chuck against her chest during the afternoon and just breathe with him, matching his rhythm, letting him feel the vibration of her voice when she hummed. She would narrate the world outside the window, the snow, the delivery trucks, the neighbor's dog barking 4 houses down, She gave him language not as instruction, but as gift, wrapping him in words the way the nursery should have been wrapped in warmth from the beginning. On a Tuesday in the 5th week, Chuck lifted his hand and placed it on Jennifer's cheek. It was not a reflex. It was not a spasm. His small palm pressed flat against her skin, fingers spread, and he looked at her with those dark, serious eyes. And Jennifer understood that this child had been listening to everything. Every song, every story, every whispered confession she'd made to these boys in the small hours of the night. And he had been deciding, slowly and carefully, whether she was safe. She was crying before she even realized it. And Richard was watching. He'd taken to checking the nursery monitor in his study late at night. Something he told himself was about security, about making sure the new nurse wasn't stealing or calling reporters. But the camera showed him things he hadn't asked to see. Jennifer, at 2 a.m, walking circles with Nathan against her shoulder, singing in Spanish, her voice cracked with exhaustion but steady. Jennifer, reading picture books to Bernard during his feeding, holding the pages up to his unfocused eyes, pointing at colors he might never name. Jennifer, asleep in the rocking chair with Chuck in her arms, both of them breathing in unison. He started arriving home earlier, not to the nursery, to his study, 1 floor below, where he could hear, faintly, the sound of her guitar through the ceiling. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he was monitoring an employee. On the 6th week, the lie collapsed. Jennifer was in the nursery at 8 p.m, all 3 boys awake and calm. Bernard propped in his adaptive chair, Nathan in Jennifer's lap, Chuck on a blanket on the floor doing his slow, determined version of reaching for a stuffed elephant. The guitar was playing softly from the speaker, a recording Jennifer had made of herself, so the music continued even when her hands were full. Richard appeared in the doorway. He'd come from a meeting, still in his charcoal suit, the shadow of something violent still sitting behind his eyes. The kind of night where the business reminded him exactly what he was. He stood there, filling the frame, and Jennifer looked up with Nathan against her chest and simply said, "Bernard's been waiting all day for someone new to show off for. He can hold a rattle now. Do you want to see?" It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a plea. It was an invitation as ordinary as offering coffee. And maybe that's, why it worked. Because it assumed he was capable of something no one had assumed in 18 months. Richard crossed the room. He moved carefully, the way a man walks through a house he's forgotten he owns. He knelt beside Bernard's chair, lowered himself to his son's eye level, his expensive suit pressing against the nursery floor. And Bernard looked at his father for the first time with something other than passive blankness. Jennifer placed the small rattle in Bernard's hand. Bernard gripped it, shook it once. The sound was tiny, barely a whisper of plastic beads. But Bernard's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. A beginning. Richard's face didn't change. But his hand, the hand that signed orders, that had broken bones, that controlled an empire measured in millions, that hand trembled as he reached out and touched his son's cheek with his fingertips. "He has her mouth," Richard said quietly. It was the first time he'd mentioned Claire to anyone in 18 months. "All 3 of them. They have her mouth." Jennifer said nothing. She held Nathan closer and let the silence carry the weight of everything Richard wasn't ready to say. He stayed for 40 minutes. He didn't hold the boys. He didn't speak again. But he stayed, sitting on the nursery floor in his $3,000 suit, watching his sons exist in a room that finally had light and sound and warmth. And when he left, he didn't close the door behind him. It was the first door he'd left open in a very long time. Jennifer found the photo album on a Sunday. She hadn't meant to. She'd gone into the second-floor study looking for a pen to label medication bottles, and it was there on the bottom shelf of the desk, half hidden beneath tax folders. A leather-bound book, burgundy, with no title on the cover. She knew she shouldn't open it. She opened it. Claire Davis had documented her pregnancy with the precision of a woman who understood that joy is fragile and should be preserved in detail. Every page was a record. Ultrasound images labeled by week, handwritten notes in looping cursive. Week 12. 3 heartbeats. Richard cried. He'll deny it. Week 20. They're boys. 3 boys. Richard already wants to name one after his father. I said absolutely not. Week 28. They're kicking at the same time now. It feels like a tiny riot in there. I love it. The last entry was at 32 weeks. I'm scared. They're coming early. And the doctors keep using words like risk and intervention. And I can see Richard pretending he's not terrified. But I looked at him last night while he was sleeping and I thought, whatever happens, these boys will have the best father in the world. He just doesn't know it yet. Jennifer closed the album. Her hands were shaking. She found Marcus in the kitchen that evening and asked the question she'd been holding since the night she found the third-floor nursery. What happened to her? Marcus set down his coffee mug. He looked at Jennifer for a long moment, assessing, measuring, and then he told her. Claire had gone into labor at 33 weeks, emergency cesarean. The boys came out blue and silent. Bernard first, then Nathan, then Chuck, each smaller than the last. Each rushed to the NICU before Richard could count their fingers. The doctors worked on Claire for an hour. Placental abruption. Hemorrhage. Richard was in the hallway, still wearing the shirt she'd gripped during the first contraction, when the surgeon came out and couldn't meet his eyes. He'd walked into the room. Claire was still warm. The monitors were flat-lined but still connected, as if someone had forgotten to acknowledge what the silence meant. Richard had sat beside her and held her hand for 3 hours. When Marcus finally entered the room, Richard was still holding it, and his face had become something Marcus had never seen before. Not grief, not rage, but absence. As if the man who walked in had not walked out. He went to the NICU once, Marcus said. Saw the boys in their incubators, all the tubes and monitors, and I watched something in him break. He said, and I remember this exactly. They look like her, and she's gone. I can't look at them without seeing what I lost. He never went back. In 18 months, he pays for everything. The best doctors, the best equipment, the best nurses money can find. He tells himself that's enough, that providing is the same as being present. Marcus paused. It's not, but it's all he can manage. Jennifer sat with this for 3 days. She carried it while she fed the boys, while she sang, while she held Chuck against her chest and felt his hand on her cheek. She carried it while she watched the nursery monitor Richard didn't know she knew about. Watched the small green light that meant someone on the other end was looking, every single night, at sons he couldn't bring himself to touch. On Wednesday evening, she went to his study. Richard was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled too, his elbows, reading something on his laptop that made the vein in his temple visible. He looked up when she knocked, and his expression shifted through 3 phases: surprise, neutrality, defense, in under a second. The boys' medical reports are submitted monthly, he said. If there's an issue... Bernard held a rattle for 14 seconds today, Jennifer said. Nathan slept through the night without a single spasm. Chuck put his hand on my face and held it there for a full minute. She paused. They're waking up, Mr. Davis. They're in there. They've always been in there. And they need their father. Richard's jaw tightened. They have everything they need. They have equipment. They have medication. They have a rotation of strangers who come and go. They don't have you. You don't know what you're... I read Claire's album. The temperature in the room dropped. Richard stood slowly, and for the first time, Jennifer understood physically what it meant that this man controlled, an empire built on fear. He was tall, broad, and in that moment, every line of his body was a warning. You had no right. No, I didn't. But Claire wrote that you'd be the best father in the world. She believed that. And right now, your sons are on the second floor learning to smile because a stranger sings to them, while their father watches from a security camera because he's too afraid to walk through the door. Richard's hands were flat on the desk. His knuckles were white. His breathing had changed, shorter, sharper. And Jennifer could see the grief moving through him like a physical thing, cracking the surface he'd maintained for 18 months. You think I don't want to? His voice was low, ragged. You think I chose this? Every time I look at them, I see her. Every time I hear them cry, I hear the monitor flatlining. I buried my wife and came home to 3 children who will never walk, never run, never call me dad, and I can't. He stopped. His hand went to his face. And Richard Davis, the most feared man on Chicago's North Side, pressed his palm against his eyes and breathed like a man drowning. Jennifer didn't move. She didn't offer comfort. She waited, because grief this old demands witness, not rescue. When he lowered his hand, his eyes were red. His voice was barely a whisper. Show me. Show me how to be with them. I don't know how. She took him to the nursery. It was 9 o'clock. The boys were settling for sleep. The room dimmed, the speaker playing soft guitar. Jennifer picked up Nathan, the most tactile of the 3, and placed him in Richard's arms. Richard held his son like something made of glass. His hands were too large, too rough, too uncertain. Nathan's head rested against his father's chest, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then Nathan's hand found the fabric of Richard's shirt and gripped it. Tiny fingers, weak but deliberate, closing around the cotton like an anchor. Richard looked down at his son, and the sound he made was not crying. It was deeper than that, more primal, the sound of a wall collapsing after 18 months of bearing weight it was never designed to hold. Jennifer sat in the rocking chair with Bernard in her lap and Chuck in his crib beside her, and she didn't wipe her own tears, because some moments are too sacred to interrupt, even with kindness. 6 weeks. That's how long the peace lasted. The morning it shattered started like any other. Jennifer in the nursery at 6. Curtains open, Nathan propped against her shoulder while she prepared Bernard's morning feed. Chuck was awake, tracking a mobile of colored rings that Jennifer had hung the week before, his dark eyes following the slow orbit with focused intensity. Richard had started coming in before he left for work. Not for long. 5 minutes. 10. But he'd stand by the cribs and touch each boy's hand. A brief, deliberate contact, as if reminding himself and them that he existed in their world now. That morning, he'd lingered. He'd watched Chuck watching the mobile and said quietly, "He's the sharpest of the 3, isn't he?" "He's been listening to everything since the day I arrived," Jennifer had replied. "He's just careful about who he lets in." Richard had looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken moved between them. Something that had been building for weeks in the space between lullabies and late-night monitor lights. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment dissolved, and he was gone. 2 hours later, Marcus appeared in the nursery doorway. His face told Jennifer everything before his mouth did. "We need to talk. Downstairs." In the kitchen, Marcus placed a tablet on the granite counter. On the screen was a photograph. A woman in her late 30s, sharp-featured, blonde hair pulled back tight. Meredith Vale, the 12th nurse, the one who'd been caught photographing documents. "She resurfaced," Marcus said. "She's been feeding information to Victor Harlan. Jennifer knew the name only from fragments, overheard conversations between security staff, a tightness in Marcus's voice whenever the South Side was mentioned. Victor Harlan ran the rival organization. Where Richard operated through legitimate business fronts and unspoken rules, Harlan was blunt force, drugs, intimidation, territory wars. He'd been trying to destabilize Richard's operation for years, and now he had an inside source. Meredith has medical records, Marcus continued. The boys. Complete files, diagnoses, treatment protocols, everything. She's threatening to leak them to the press. Mafia boss hides disabled children. That's the story she's selling. And Harlan is funding it because the media circus would force Richard into the open, make him vulnerable. Jennifer felt cold spread through her chest. The boys would be exposed. Photographers outside the house. Their faces in every tabloid. That's the point. What is Richard going to do? Marcus didn't answer, immediately. And in that silence, Jennifer heard the second thing he'd come to tell her. Jennifer. His voice was different now. Careful. Tony Ruiz has been making calls, asking questions about you, about what you've seen in the house, what you know about the security setup. He's been contacted by someone in Harlan's organization. The cold in her chest became ice. Tony sent me here to pay a debt. That's all. I believe you. But Richard's head of security pulled your file this morning. The debt. Tony Ruiz. The connection to the organization. It's all there. Marcus met her eyes. Richard knows why you're really here. Jennifer's hands gripped the counter's edge. I need to talk to him. He doesn't want to see you. Marcus. He called you a plant. Those were his words. 12 nurses, 12 betrayals, and now you, the one who got the closest, the one who made him walk into that nursery for the first time. You came here because a loan shark sent you. That's why I came. It's not why I stayed. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been compassion, or might have been pity. That distinction matters to you and me. I'm not sure it matters to him right now. Richard didn't come to the nursery that evening, or the next morning. The monitor light, the green glow that had become, for Jennifer, a silent confirmation that he was watching, that he hadn't fully retreated, stayed dark. On the second day, Mrs. Brennan came to the nursery with an envelope. Inside was a check for 4 months' salary and a single typed line. Your services are no longer required. The debt is cleared. Jennifer stared at the words. The debt she'd carried for 2 years. The weight that had bent her life into this shape, that had brought her to this house, to these boys, to this man, was gone. She was free. She packed her bag. She kissed Bernard's forehead, then Nathan's, then Chuck's. Chuck's hand reached for her as she pulled away, fingers grasping at air, and a sound came from his throat. Not a word, not a cry, but a protest, small and desperate and unmistakable. Jennifer left before she could change her mind. The next 72 hours were the longest of Richard's life. Nathan's spasms returned with a vengeance. 3 clusters in the first night, 4 in the second, his small body arching and trembling, while the night nurse fumbled with dosages Jennifer had memorized weeks ago. Bernard stopped responding to music. The replacement nurse played the same. Playlists used the same speaker, sat in the same chair, but Bernard's fingers didn't move. His eyes found the ceiling and stayed there. The rattle sat untouched. And Chuck. Chuck turned to the wall. Richard watched from the monitor. He watched his sons unravel, and he felt the thing he'd been running from for 18 months, the specific, surgical agony of watching your children suffer and knowing that this time, you are the cause. On the third night, Marcus found Richard in his study at 2 in the morning, staring at the monitor showing Chuck's crib. The boy hadn't moved in 6 hours. She came here on a debt, Richard said, without looking up. Everything she did, the music, the holding, the way she made them respond, It was a transaction. Marcus sat down. Was it? She was sent by Tony Ruiz. She was. And then she sang to your sons at 2 a.m. when no one was watching. She fought with you in this study to make you hold your own child. She cried when Chuck touched her face. Marcus leaned forward. Richard, I've watched 12 women come through this house. 11 of them did the job. 1 of them photographed your files, but only 1 of them made those boys come alive. You know the difference. Richard said nothing. On the monitor, Chuck lay still, facing the wall, waiting for a voice that wasn't coming. Jennifer's apartment in Humboldt Park was a studio on the 3rd floor of a building where the radiator worked on its own schedule, and the walls were thin, enough to hear every argument 2 floors down. She'd been back for 3 days. The silence was the worst part, not the absence of sound, but the absence of the specific sounds that had become her world. Nathan's breathy laugh, Bernard's rattle, Chuck's quiet, intentional breathing when he was listening hardest, the creak of the nursery rocking chair. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Chuck's hand reaching for her as she pulled away, grasping at nothing. She saw the protest in his eyes, the look of a child who had finally decided to trust and was watching that trust walk out the door. On the 4th morning, her phone rang. Marcus. The boys are regressing. Nathan's had 7 spasm clusters in 3 days. Bernard's gone non-responsive to music therapy. Chuck hasn't vocalized since you left. A pause. The new nurse is competent. She's not you. Jennifer pressed her forehead against the cold window glass. He fired me. Marcus. I know. He thinks I was spying for Harlan. He knows you weren't. He's known since the 2nd day. He pulled Tony Ruiz in for a conversation, and Tony confirmed the arrangement was strictly about the debt. Nothing more. No connection to Harlan. Then why hasn't he? Because admitting he was wrong means admitting he needs you. And Richard Davis has built his entire life on the principle that needing someone is the most dangerous thing a man can do. Jennifer closed her eyes. Then, she opened them and reached for her coat. She didn't call ahead. She took the blue line to Clark, walked 8 blocks in February wind that sliced through her thin jacket, and arrived at the gates of the Davis estate at 11 a.m. The security guard recognized her. He hesitated. She waited. He opened the gate. She was halfway across the foyer when the sound hit her. Not the silence she'd expected, but voices, raised voices, coming from the 2nd floor. Jennifer took the stairs 2, at a time. The nursery door was open. Inside, a woman Jennifer had never seen, tall, blonde, sharp-featured, stood near the cribs with a phone in her hand, and behind her, 2 men in dark coats who didn't belong in a nursery. Meredith Vale. She'd walked in through the front door with credentials the new nurse hadn't thought to question, and she was photographing the boys. Bernard was crying, a thin, frightened sound that Jennifer knew meant overstimulation. Nathan was mid-spasm, his body rigid, untended. The new nurse was pressed against the wall, terrified, and Chuck. Chuck was looking directly at Jennifer in the doorway. Get away from them. Jennifer's voice came out lower than she expected, steadier. She crossed the room and placed herself between the cribs and Meredith, her back to the boys, her body a barrier. Meredith lowered the phone, smiled. You must be the replacement who actually lasted. Impressive. But this isn't your problem anymore. I said get away from them. One of the men stepped forward. Jennifer didn't move. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. But she didn't move, because behind her, Bernard was crying, and Nathan was seizing and Chuck was watching. And she had promised. Not in words, not in any contractual sense, but in every lullaby and every touch, and every night she'd spent in that rocking chair. She had promised these boys she would keep them safe. The standoff lasted 12 seconds. Then Richard's voice filled the room like a physical force. Meredith. He stood in the doorway. He was not wearing a suit. He was in the clothes he'd slept in. Dark shirt, pants, and his face carried the look of a man who had been awake for 72 hours and had come to the end of every lie he'd ever told himself. Behind him, Marcus and 3 members of his security team filled the hallway. Meredith's smile flickered. The 2 men in coats shifted uncomfortably. Richard, you were photographing my children. His voice was quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet. In their nursery, while one of them was having a seizure. Jennifer saw his hands. She saw what they wanted to do. She saw 18 months of grief and rage and impotence converge into a single violent impulse that would solve nothing and traumatize everyone in this room. Richard. She said his name, and he looked at her. For the first time since the study, he looked at her. And she shook her head. Once. Small. Certain. Not like this. Not in front of them. Something shifted behind his eyes. The violence receded, not disappeared, but receded. And in its place, something harder and more deliberate took hold. Marcus, Richard said, call Detective Brennan at CPD. Have Meredith Vale and these 2 gentlemen escorted off the property. Then contact the state's attorney's office. Ms. Vale has been selling stolen medical records of minors to a criminal organization. I believe that's several felonies. Meredith's face went white. You can't. Harlan will receive the same offer tomorrow. Cooperate with the federal investigation I've been building for 6 months, or face prosecution alongside you. Richard stepped aside to let security enter. Your choice. As Meredith was led from the room, Richard turned to Jennifer. She was still standing between the cribs, her back to the boys, her hand shaking now that the adrenaline was crashing. Nathan's spasm had passed. Bernard's crying had softened to whimpers. And Chuck was making a sound that resolved, slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably into a syllable. Jennifer spun. Chuck was looking at her, his small face earnest and fierce and determined, and he said it again. Jen. His first word. Spoken into a room that had been 30 seconds before, full of threat and fear. Spoken to the woman who had come back. Richard watched from the doorway. His eyes were bright. His jaw was tight. And when Jennifer looked at him, tears streaming, hand pressed over her mouth, knees buckling. He crossed the room and caught her before she hit the floor. He held her. Standing in the nursery, surrounded by 3 boys, and the aftermath of a confrontation that could have ended in blood but didn't, Richard Davis held Jennifer Torres against his chest and pressed his face into her hair and said nothing, because there are moments where language fails and only presence speaks. Chuck said Jen 1 more time, quietly, like he was practicing. And the room, for the first time, felt like what Claire had always meant it to be. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, reluctantly, grudgingly, as if the city had to earn every degree above freezing. By mid-March, the snow had retreated to gray ridges along the curbs, and the first pale sunlight in months angled through the nursery windows and found 3 boys who were no longer the same children Jennifer had met in January. Bernard could sit supported in his adaptive chair for 40 minutes. His hand grip had strengthened enough to hold a soft brush, and on Tuesday afternoons, Jennifer would put watercolors in front of him and guide his hand across paper, and he would paint. Wild, uncontrolled strokes of blue and green that meant nothing to anyone except his father, who hung every single one on the refrigerator in the mansion's enormous kitchen. Richard had started eating breakfast there instead of his study. He said it was more convenient. Jennifer knew it. Was because he wanted to see the paintings. Nathan's spasm clusters had reduced to 3 or 4 per week, managed now with a combination of medication and the weighted blanket Jennifer had ordered. a deep pressure tool that mimicked the sensation of being held. His laughter, that breathy, vibrating sound, had become the background music of the household. He laughed at Jennifer's singing, at Marcus's deep voice reading picture books with exaggerated animal sounds, and especially at Richard, who had discovered, to everyone's astonishment, including his own, that he could make his son laugh by simply making eye contact and raising one eyebrow. "It's not that funny," Richard had said the first time, baffled, while Nathan shook with giggles. "It's the funniest thing in his world," Jennifer had replied. "Do it again." He did, every morning. And Chuck was talking, not fluently, not in sentences, but in words, deliberate, hard-won words that he deployed with the strategic precision of someone who understood that language was power. Jen was first. No was second, usually directed at anyone attempting to take him from Jennifer's arms. Moore was third, during music time, banging his hand weakly against her guitar when she stopped playing. And on a Thursday evening in late March, while Richard was sitting on the nursery floor with all three boys for what had become their nightly routine, Chuck looked at his father and said, clearly and without hesitation, "Da." Richard went very still. Chuck said it again, "Da." Then he reached his small hand toward Richard's face, the same gesture he'd first made with Jennifer months ago. Palm flat, fingers spread, pressing against his father's cheek. Richard caught his son's hand and held it there. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything that 18 months of silence had been holding. And Jennifer, watching from the rocking chair with Bernard in her lap and Nathan dozing against her shoulder, let herself believe that some fractures, given enough time and enough tenderness, could heal into something stronger than what was there before. 2 days later, Richard asked her to come to his study. The room had changed. The laptop was closed. Claire's photo album sat on the desk, open, and beside it, a legal document. Jennifer recognized Tony Ruiz's name on the first page. "The debt is void," Richard said. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, looking at the garden where the first crocuses were pushing through thawed soil. "It was void the day I fired you. I paid Tony the full amount and informed him that any further contact with you would be inadvisable." Jennifer looked at the document. "You didn't have to." "I also had my attorney draft this." He picked up a second folder and handed it to her. Inside was a formal employment contract. Jennifer Torres, full-time care coordinator for Bernard, Nathan, and Charles Davis. Salary, benefits, housing provisions, medical, insurance. A real position. A real commitment. "No more debts," Richard said. "No more arrangements. You're here because you choose to be, or you're not here at all." Jennifer held the folder. Her throat was tight. "And if I choose to be here?" Richard turned from the window. In the afternoon light, with his sleeves rolled and his guard lowered, he looked like the man Claire had written about in her album. The one who cried at ultrasounds and denied it. The one who was going to be the best. Father in the world and just didn't know it yet. "If you choose to be here," he said, "then I should probably tell you that I opened Claire's nursery." Jennifer's breath caught. "The 3rd floor. I had it cleaned, repainted. New cribs, adaptive ones this time. The murals are the same. Claire picked those herself." He paused. "The boys should sleep in the room their mother made for them. I should have done it 18 months ago. I couldn't." He stopped. Tried again. "You taught me that protecting them means being present for them. Not watching from a monitor. Not signing checks. Being there. In the room. On the floor. Holding the rattle." He reached into his desk and pulled out a small, burned fragment of paper. Jennifer recognized it. the corner of Tony Ruiz's original debt document. "I burned it," Richard said. "Marcus recorded it for legal purposes. But I needed to destroy the thing that brought you here, so that whatever comes next has nothing to do with obligation." Jennifer set the folder down. She crossed the room. She stood in front of Richard Davis, close enough to see the pulse at his throat, and she did something she'd never done. She placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart, the same gesture Chuck had taught them both. "Claire was right," she said quietly, "about who you'd become." Richard covered her hand with his. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That evening, the boys slept in Claire's nursery for the first time. The murals glowed soft in the nightlight. Savannah animals watching over 3 small boys in 3 adaptive cribs. A mobile of silver moons turning slowly above them. Bernard's latest painting was taped to the wall beside the changing table. Nathan's weighted blanket was tucked around him. Chuck was asleep on his side, one hand curled around the stuffed elephant Jennifer had given him, the other reaching through the crib rails toward his brothers. Richard stood in the doorway with Jennifer beside him. The room smelled like fresh paint and lavender. The diffuser Jennifer had placed on the shelf where Claire's photograph still sat, now joined by a second frame. A photo Marcus had taken 2 weeks ago, unposed, of Richard on the nursery floor with all 3 boys in his lap, and Jennifer beside them, laughing at something Nathan had done. "She would have loved them so much," Richard said. "She does," Jennifer replied. "Through you, through every painting on the fridge and every eyebrow. That makes Nathan laugh, and every time Chuck says "da," and your whole face changes. She's here." Richard put his arm around her shoulders. Not possessively, not desperately. The way you hold someone when you finally accepted that needing them isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you've ever done. Claire's nursery held its breath. The moons turned. 3 boys slept. And in a limestone mansion on Astor Street, in a city that doesn't forgive and rarely forgets, a family, built not from blood, or obligation or debt, but from lullabies and patience and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent choice to stay, was finally, irreversibly, home. Sometimes the thing that saves us isn't the grand gesture. It isn't the rescue at midnight or the villain defeated. It's the small things. A hand on a cheek, a song in the dark, a man kneeling on a nursery floor because someone showed him it was safe to be that small. Jennifer walked into that house to pay someone else's debt. She left with a family she didn't know she was building. And Richard, the man the city feared, the man who locked doors and watched from monitors and told himself that distance was the same as protection. He learned the hardest lesson of all, that you cannot love someone from the other side of a closed door. You have to walk through it. Maybe that's the truth for all of us. The doors we're most afraid to open are the ones that lead to the rooms where we're needed most. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment broke you? Chuck's first word? Richard holding Nathan for the first time? Tell us. We read every single one. Hit like to support more stories like this, and subscribe to Redemption Tales. We bring you new emotional journeys every single day. Before you go, check out the next video on screen, or explore our playlist for more tales of love, redemption, and the families we choose. Thank you for being here tonight. Stay safe, stay hopeful, and remember, even the most locked doors can be opened if someone on the other side is brave enough to knock. Good night.